Right, so Israel has spent years convincing the world that a boatload of bandages and baby milk is a weapon of mass destruction, that sacks of flour are an existential threat, that activists with cameras are somehow more dangerous than drones with missiles. Every flotilla that dares set sail for Gaza is denounced as terrorism at sea. Every passenger rebranded as a smuggler, every crate of medicine spun into contraband. Yet this year the script has very much been unravelling, because the Global Sumud Flotilla isn't sailing naked into Israel's blockade. Preparing to stand alongside this flotilla and do that has just grown again. Right, so a convoy of small ships nudging out into the Mediterranean, fragile when measured against the likes of the Israeli Navy, the destroyers, and their drones that prowl the waters. The Global Sumud Flotilla is seen as an armada. I've called it as much myself, but it doesn't carry missiles or soldiers as an armada typically would. But it does carry something Israel does seem to be rather afraid of, because it carries flour and insulin and baby formula and medical supplies and right, so a convoy of small ships nudging out into the Mediterranean, fragile when measured against the likes of the Israeli Navy, the destroyers, and their drones that prowl the waters. The Global Sumud Flotilla is seen as an armada. I've called it as much myself, but it doesn't carry missiles or soldiers as an armada typically would. But it does carry something Israel does seem to be rather afraid of, because it carries flour and insulin and baby formula and medical supplies and, well, an awful lot of international solidarity, it seems. It carries activists, journalists and retired MPs and union organisers and students, all people who refuse to look away while Gaza is starving. They sail not to attack, but to break a siege, to expose a crime, to remind the world that silence itself has become a weapon, and that it is complicity. And Israel predictably calls them terrorists, don't they? It always does. Every flotilla, every aid boat is recast in Tel Aviv's propaganda machine as an existential threat to their very survival, even as they eliminate the means to survive of another people entirely. Humanitarian cargo becomes weapons smuggling, and civilian activists become security risks. Aid is rebranded as terror. These are grotesque excuses repeated with a straight face, even as the world watches footage of starving children by their hand. Israel insists its blockade is about security, but security from what? From bandages? From powdered milk? From foreign journalists armed with the greatest weapon of them all to ever be deployed against Israel? A camera? It would be laughable if it weren't so deadly serious. The sickening lie is the cause. The flotilla's defiance is the effect. And now that effect is backfiring even more than I reported on earlier this week. Because this time, the flotilla, already the largest there has ever been, is not alone. For the first time in its history, as it also now carries a shield. Not a naval escort, not a military protection per se, but a shield made out of people, of unions, of mayors, of dockers, of regional authorities and national governments. A shield reinforced by those 16 nations, that bodyguard of flags that have pledged to turn any boarding party into a major diplomatic incident. Israel has its warships. The flotilla now has dock cranes and regional governors, trade unions and international solidarity. It is fragile, yes, but it's also fortified in a way no flotilla has ever been before. So it's a shield. Makes sense of how these things actually constitute a shield then, Damo. Well, clearly these are distant entities, aren't they? Dock cranes aren't boarding ships after all, so how can they be acting as a shield then? To understand how this shield has come into being, let's start in Italy. Specifically Ravenna, not Genoa, where I've done other videos and covered, not Livorno, where there's been issues before for Israel, not the ports most associated with militant dockers who have already taken Israel to task at the wharf side, but Ravenna on the Adriatic coast, northern Italy, a place few outside of Italy would ever actually have thought of being a front line, yet it has become just that. 2 trucks suspected of carrying explosives bound for Israel rolled into Ravenna's port, and they were stopped. This time not by striking dockers alone, though, but by the mayor, by the regional government of Emilia-Romagna, and by the port authority itself. Local politicians, civic institutions, the machinery of local government itself intervened in a major first, and the cargo was blocked. Ravenna's port authority refused the truck's access after local officials intervened. It was emphasised that it was the mayor and the regional government who acted after dockers raised the alarm, so this was very much a civic decision, therefore. A port, backed by elected authority, refusing to be a conduit for Israel's war machine. That is new. For years, resistance in Italy was labour-driven. Livorno dockers in May of 2021 refused to load weapons when Gaza was under bombardment then. Genoa dockers that same year blocked the Asiatic island after discovering hidden arms in its containers. In 2024 and again this year, more refusals, more blockades, again led by unions. People power. These were heroic acts, but they were vulnerable to being dismissed as radical outbursts by the mainstream media. Well, this incident in Ravenna has just changed that. This was a mayor, a region, a port authority siding with those workers this time. It was institutional. It was official. It was the machinery of governance saying, not through here. Ravenna became the first civic layer of the flotilla's shield, therefore. And if Ravenna shows the state can move when pushed, Genoa shows what happens when the workers take a lead. Genoa's got form for that, haven't they? This is a port where dockers have refused several times before. Back in 2021, they refused to load one shipment and then another. They traced bills of lading, that's shipping contracts which are combined with manifests, and as a result uncovered hidden crates of weapons and said, no, we aren't moving that. In 2024, they did it again. And this year, they refused to unload Israeli weaponry too. This is not isolated protest. It's a tradition there now. Genoa has always been a port of defiance, a city with an anti-fascist soul, a workforce that understands solidarity very, very well. And now they've gone even further. This time, Genoa's dockers have issued a pledge that if the Global Sumud Flotilla is attacked, expected as the flotilla is in Genoa in a couple of days' time with more ships set to join that main fleet, if contact is lost with them for more than 20 minutes, if Israel dares to lay a hand on those boats this time, then Genoa will close itself to Israel completely. Not a single nail will leave anymore, they have declared. Dockers, you see, have the power to enforce that, even if, in their case, local administration doesn't have their back, because without them, containers do not move. Without their hands, ships do not sail. It's skilled work that these people do. You can't just find some scabs to cross a picket line to do the work instead. It is not that simple. And Genoa's dockers have already proved they are willing to act, so the pledge is credible. It's not another idle threat, it's another component to this shield surrounding the Global Sumud Flotilla now. Israel knows that to attack the flotilla now is to risk an industrial blockade in one of Europe's major ports. They're almost certainly too arrogant to care, of course. Learning the hard way, I fear, is how it will go. But if that's their choice, so be it. But their logistics network would shrink that little bit more, and it would bite that little bit harder, regardless of what they might say. Then there's Spain. Spain is different again, because it shows what happens when a government, not just unions, not just local governance, takes a stand. In Spain's government, they've now banned ships carrying fuel for Israel's military from docking in any of its ports. At the same time, Spanish dockers have pledged to support the flotilla by refusing to handle cargo linked to the genocide. Now, this is not a perfect plan. Spain has not declared a total embargo, but it is still historic, and again, dockers can raise the bar. It is nevertheless a European government now refusing to resupply Israel's military. Combined with worker action, it becomes yet another layer of this shield. Greece adds another strand. Dockers at Piraeus have blocked a shipment of ammunition bound for Israel. That refusal was not tied to the flotilla, but it did set a precedent. Greek unions have still pledged to act if the flotilla is attacked. Thessaloniki dockers have hinted at exactly the same thing there. It's another link in the chain of solidarity, another weakness in Israel's logistics, another layer to the shield. And then there is the continental dimension, because these are not isolated acts. Dock workers from Italy, Greece, Belgium, Sweden and France announced they would coordinate their actions. And as the flotilla prepared to sail, they renewed their pledge. If Israel assaults the Global Sumud Flotilla, they would launch a Europe-wide blockade. That's the kind of language Israel understands. Not outrage, not concern. They don't respond to that. Blockade is a word they know because they blockaded Gaza for long enough. The shield, then, is multi-layered, isn't it? Ravenna's civic intervention, Genoa's industrial muscle, Spain's government ban, Greece's precedent, a Europe-wide network of dock workers threatening continental shutdown. And then on the sea itself, 16 of the nations represented on the flotilla, 16 flags, 16 passports, 16 potential diplomatic incidents. Every passenger a witness, every flag a bodyguard, because their nations in a joint statement assumed that role, as I covered the other day. And here is where the economic consequences matter. The shield is not just moral, it is material. When dock workers threaten to block Israel's cargo, this is not symbolism, it's economics. Consider Genoa. This is Italy's biggest seaport by tonnage, a hub that handles millions of containers each year. Ravenna is a lot smaller, certainly, but strategically placed on the Adriatic coast. It's another key gateway, therefore. Piraeus in Greece, owned in part by Chinese shipping giant COSCO, is one of the fastest growing ports in the Mediterranean, a central node in Europe-Asia supply chains. Together, these ports form a significant part of the lifeline of European logistics. Now ask yourself, how much of Israel's resupply flows through them? Israel is utterly dependent on maritime trade for over 99% of all of its imports. Its military does not live on air. Weapons, fuel, spare parts, these all arrive, for the most part, by sea, often routed through European ports, though more so than ever since the Houthis effectively shut the Red Sea down to them, of course. Even if only a fraction passes through Genoa or Ravenna or Piraeus, though, the threat of disruption is enough to raise alarm in boardrooms and ministries alike. Shipping is not infinitely flexible. Rerouting cargo around hostile ports is costly, time-consuming, and politically risky, as Israel already knows, thanks to the Houthis. If Spain bans military shipments, if Ravenna refuses unloading of military cargo, if Genoa strikes and won't unload even a single nail, Israel must scramble for alternatives, and the number of alternatives is shrinking. Every diversion means delays, extra costs, insurance hikes, reputational damage. Think of it like this. War is expensive and logistics is its bloodstream. Cut the bloodstream and the body weakens, doesn't it? Genoa's pledge, not a single nail will leave, is not just poetic. It's a direct threat to the flow of material that sustains Israel's war machine. Ravenna's refusal to handle 2 trucks of explosives was not symbolism, it was a blockade in miniature. Proof that one mayor and one port authority could choke a supply line, and that should be inspiration for many others. Spain's ban on military fuel ships is not a gesture, it is a barrier that forces Israel to scramble for an alternative. Economists sometimes speak of choke points when it comes to global trade, especially global sea trade. Let's think of places like the Suez Canal or the Strait of Hormuz or the Bab el-Mandeb Strait or the Panama Canal. But ports are choke points as well, especially when workers close the gates. If dockers in Genoa or Livorno or Ravenna or Piraeus all act together, Israel's supply chain faces a siege all of its own. And unlike the naval blockade of Gaza, which is enforced by warships, this siege is enforced by labour, the withdrawal of hands that move containers, the refusal of cranes to lift cargo, the solidarity of workers who understand their power as a collective. And make no mistake, capital listens when trade is threatened. This is the inherent weakness of capitalism we're looking at here as well. Governments may ignore protests, they may brush off street demonstrations, they may even suppress marches. But when ships cannot dock, when containers pile up, when contracts are breached, suddenly their ears prick up. Suddenly ministers pay attention because trade disruption costs money, and money is the only language some of these states understand. That is why dockworkers' solidarity is more than symbolic, it's leverage. It's a shield. It is economics turned into politics. It is a weapon Israel cannot bomb into submission. So what does it ultimately mean for Israel then? Well, it means every option leads to exposure. Attack this flotilla and you risk dockers in Genoa and Ravenna, workers in Spain, unions in Greece and Belgium shutting down your cargo. You risk a Europe-wide blockade now, headlines that choke your propaganda. Let the flotilla through and the blockade of Gaza is punctured. Ignore it, and the images of defiance will sail across screens worldwide. Every move Israel could possibly think of here backfires on them. The siege you impose threatens to become the siege you face, and beyond economics lies more symbolism. And that symbolism can be devastating in itself. Gaza has been under siege for nearly 2 decades. Israel insists it has the right to blockade, the right to starve, the right to control every calorie, every litre of fuel, every shipment of medicine that enters the strip. The language is always the same. Security. But what the world sees here is not security anymore. It sees the deliberate weaponization of hunger. It sees children dying because antibiotics cannot pass checkpoints. It sees hospitals collapsing because fuel for generators is denied. It sees a prison sealed off by land, sea and air. Now flip that picture around. Imagine Israel itself facing a siege, not from armies, not from navies, but from dock workers and local councils. Imagine the jailer discovering that locks on his own gates have been locked up from the outside. That's the symbolic reversal now in play. When Ravenna blocks trucks, when Genoa pledges to choke trade, when Spain bans resupply, when Europe's dockers talk of a continental blockade, the symbolism is devastating. It says, you are no longer untouchable. The world you blockade can blockade you back. The flotilla, small though it is, larger than any before it nonetheless, carries this symbolism in its very hulls. Its sails fragile, yes, but with every kilometre it travels, it exposes the lie of Israel's security all the more. If a handful of aid boats can terrify a regional superpower, as they clearly do, what does that say about the legitimacy of its siege? If dock workers and mayors and regional governors can threaten to choke off its supply lines, what does that say about Israel's claim to invulnerability? Symbolism matters because it breaks narratives. Israel has always depended on narrative control. It insists it is the victim, even as it bombs hospitals in Gaza. It insists it is defending itself, even as it starves civilians in Gaza. It insists flotillas are terrorism, even when all they're carrying is baby formula and similar essential items. Symbolism of dock workers refusing, of ports closing, of mayors stepping in punctures that narrative. It replaces the story of Israeli security with the story of global solidarity. It shows that Gaza is not alone. The resistance can come from dock cranes as well as rockets, from mayors as well as militants, from aid ships as well as armies. And there's another symbolic reversal at work too. Israel's blockade is enforced with warships and missiles. The flotilla's shield is enforced with people. People refusing. People blocking, people sailing, ordinary people bearing witness, the power of ordinary working class people being shown to take on the might of Israel and this blockade. It is the difference between power imposed and power earned, frankly, isn't it? Between domination and solidarity. That symbolism cuts deeper than any naval interception because it speaks to the world's conscience. So when the flotilla sails, it's more than just a convoy. It's a mirror that's being held up to Israel's blockade, reflecting back its cruelty. A mirror that shows the jailer chained by his own locks, the besieger suddenly threatened with being besieged itself. That's why Israel fears the flotilla. Not because of what's in its holds, but because of what it represents. The possibility that solidarity, not silence, will define its future. Notice the contrast, though. Western governments issue statements and then license more weapons, don't they? And they talk of serious concerns and then shake hands with those Israeli ministers that wield the spies. They wring their hands and then do nothing. Yet workers, by contrast, act. They block, they refuse, they strike, they pull levers that actually stop the machinery of war. In Ravenna, even mayors and regional governors followed their lead. The legitimacy flows upwards, therefore, not downwards. That is the meaning of this shield. It is people-powered foreign policy at work, isn't it? Policy they've decided, not being imposed from Washington as far too many Western European states allow to happen. It is unions and civic leaders doing what governments will not, enforcing international law, resisting genocide, creating deterrence where none existed. And so the Global Sumud Flotilla sails on. It sails into dangerous waters, absolutely, but it sails with a shield. Ravenna's defiance, Genoa's pledge, Spain's ban, Greece's president, a Europe-wide network of trade unions, 16 nations pledging to be their bodyguards with the threat of sanctions as their weapons. That is what now stands between the flotilla and Israel. Not invincibility, but deterrence. Not silence, but solidarity. And for the first time, Israel's navy knows that to strike this handful of small boats is not to end the story, but to trigger a chain reaction on land and sea alike that is not going to work in their favour. Israel has warships, the flotilla has workers. Israel has drones, the flotilla has dock cranes. Israel has excuses, the flotilla has exposure. That is the shield. And that is why, whatever happens on the water, this voyage has already reshaped the battlefield. For more details on how 16 nations are now acting as de facto bodyguards for the flotilla, even before it gained this new shield, a first line of defence that they've never had before, check out this video recommendation here as your suggested next watch. Please do also hit like, share and subscribe if you haven't done so already, so as to ensure you don't miss out on all new daily content, as well as spreading the word and helping to support the channel at the same time, which is very much appreciated, holding power to account for ordinary working class people, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.